Hey everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that I think is super interesting and relevant to almost everyone listening. It's all about how employers use tests to try and figure out who the best candidates for a job are.
Yeah, you know those tests you take when you're applying for jobs?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've all been there, right? You
Yeah.
spend hours perfecting your resume, you craft the perfect cover letter, and then bam,
Yeah.
you're hit with a personality test or a skills assessment or some other kind of evaluation.
Yeah,
And it can feel like so much is riding on those scores.
for sure. It can be pretty nerve-wracking.
Totally. So we're going to take a deep dive into a method called test score banding. Have you heard of this before?
Yeah. Test score banding is a way of using those pre-employment tests that acknowledges that they're not perfect. No test can perfectly predict how someone's going to do in a job.
Right. Like you could be amazing at your job, but maybe you just don't test well. Or maybe you had a bad day or something.
Exactly. So instead of just picking the people with the absolute highest scores, banding groups people together who have similar scores into these bands.
Okay, so it's like saying if you score between a 90 and a 95, you're in this band. And if you score between an 85 and a 90, you're in a different band. That kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And this lets employers consider other factors besides just that one test score. It gives a more holistic view of the candidate.
I like that, a more holistic view. So for this deep dive, we're looking at a fascinating article from the year 2000. It's from the journal Human Performance, and it's by Aguinis.
That's Gwyn is like Guinness the beer.
Aguinis.
Oh.
Okay, got it. Aguinis, Cortina, and Goldberg. And they actually propose kind of an alternative way of doing test score banding. They're shaking things up a little bit.
Yeah, they're challenging the traditional way of doing things and offering up a new perspective.
It's like those cooking shows where they have a classic recipe and then they're like, okay, and now for a modern twist.
Exactly. So tell me, what's one of the big differences between these two approaches to test score banding?
Well, one of the key differences is in what they assume is the most important thing to look at when you're trying to predict how well someone's going to do in a job.
Okay,
Yeah.
makes sense. So how do the two approaches differ?
The traditional approach is super focused on what the test itself measures.
Okay, so if I'm hiring a software developer, I'd give them a coding test, and I'd look for strong content validity, meaning the test really reflects the actual tasks they'd be doing on the job.
You got it. But the alternative approach is like, hold on a sec. What about looking at actual job performance data? If we have info on how people are actually performing in similar jobs, shouldn't we use that too?
So they're saying, don't just look at what someone knows on paper, but also look at how they've actually performed in the real world.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's where this idea of criterion-related validity comes in. It's about making sure that your selection methods are actually predicting how well someone will do on the job, not just measuring their theoretical abilities.
So the traditional approach really zeroes in on what the test measures,
Yeah.
while the alternative approach says, let's also factor in real-world performance data if we have it.
Interesting, right? And to explain this, the authors use this really interesting analogy. They talk about a dust bowl.
A dust bowl.
Yeah. Like during the dust bowl, they say that if you just study the dune itself, it wouldn't tell you the whole story of how plants actually grow. You have to look at the sunlight, the water, the whole environment, all those factors.
Ah, I see. So they're not saying that other forms of validity are bad, it's just that if you ignore performance data when you have it, it's like you're missing a big piece of the puzzle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're not getting the full picture.
I like that analogy. It really drives the point home.
So that's one key difference between these two approaches. But there are a few more that we're going to unpack.
Can't wait to hear more.
Let's do it.
Yeah, so we've talked about how the traditional approach really emphasizes what that test measures, while the alternative approach is like, hey, let's pull in some real-world performance data if we can get our hands on it. But that's not the only difference. They also disagree on how wide those bands should be.
Oh, yeah. The bands. So they're talking about like how many points are in each band?
Exactly. And you might think that narrower bands would be better, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, if you're trying to pinpoint the absolute best candidates, wouldn't a super narrow band be more precise?
It seems intuitive, but the authors actually argue that wider bands are more useful, and that's because they recognize that tests aren't perfect predictors of job performance.
So if you make the bands too narrow, you might accidentally exclude someone who could have been a great fit, just because their score was a tiny bit lower.
Exactly. It's like saying, oh, this person got an 89 on the test and this other person got a 91, so the person with the 91 is definitely going to be better at the job. But that might not be true at all.
Right. There's so many other factors that go into job success,
Yeah.
like someone's personality, their work ethic, how well they collaborate with others.
All that stuff. And the authors of this article are really emphasizing that we need to acknowledge that people have strengths and weaknesses that might not be fully reflected in a single test score.
It's like trying to judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
Right. Exactly. It's
Yeah.
just not a fair comparison.
So wider bands help to create a more level playing field. I like that.
It's about recognizing that potential comes in many forms. And a couple of points on a test shouldn't be the only thing that determines someone's future.
Makes sense. So we've talked about performance data and bandwidth. What else sets these two approaches apart?
Well, another key difference is how they approach measuring job performance itself.
Okay. So if we're using real-world performance data, how do we actually measure that? Isn't that kind of subjective?
That's a really good question. And the authors definitely acknowledge that it's a challenge to find a truly perfect measure of job performance because it's so multifaceted. There are so many different aspects to consider.
Like what kind of things?
Well, it depends on the job, of course,
Yeah.
but it could be things like how productive someone is, how well they meet deadlines, how well they work with their team, how satisfied their customers are.
Right. So many variables.
Yeah. But even though it's tough to find a perfect measure, the authors argue that using some kind of measure of actual performance, even if it's not flawless, is still better than just relying on that pre-employment test alone.
So it's like, even if our measuring stick isn't perfectly calibrated, it's still giving us more useful information than not measuring at all.
Exactly. It's about making the best use of the data that we have available.
I dig that. So we've got performance data and bandwidth and the challenges of measuring job performance. What's next on our list of differences?
This one's a little bit technical. It has to do with what's called the reliability coefficient.
Okay, back up for a sec. What in the world is a reliability coefficient?
It's basically a way to make sure that our measuring tools are accurate.
So like if we're using a ruler to measure something, we want to make sure that the ruler is actually accurate, you know? Not like one of those wonky rulers where the inches are all messed up.
Exactly. And this applies to both the test itself and the way we're measuring job performance.
So it's like we're double-checking our work to make sure we're not introducing any bias or errors.
Right. It's about being as precise and objective as possible.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
It's all about creating a more robust and fair selection process, one that takes into account the complexity of human potential and the limitations of our measurement tools.
It's like we're trying to get the most accurate reading possible, even if we know that no measurement is ever going to be absolutely perfect.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those limitations and doing the best we can with the tools we have.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. The traditional approach, focusing on what the test measures. The alternative approach, saying, hey, let's bring in some real-world data whenever we can, different ideas about how wide the bands should be, and all the challenges of actually measuring job performance. What's the big takeaway here? What are these authors really advocating for?
They're really pushing for a more holistic and data-driven approach to personnel selection.
Okay, so less emphasis on just that one test score.
Right. And they're pretty clear on when each approach should be used. So if you don't have any job performance data available, then the traditional method is really your only option.
That makes sense. But
Yeah.
if you do have that data,
Then they strongly advocate for using the alternative approach. They believe it leads to a much more informed and ultimately more effective selection process.
it's like they're saying don't just rely on a single data point. Look at the whole picture.
Exactly. And this isn't just some theoretical debate,
Yeah.
This has real-world implications for both businesses and job seekers.
Oh, absolutely. For businesses, it's about finding the best talent and building high-performing teams.
And for job seekers, it's about having a fairer shot, knowing that your experience and your potential are being taken into consideration.
It's about leveling the playing field.
Exactly. And I think that's something we can all get behind.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of test score banding. I feel like I've learned a lot.
Me too. It's always great to challenge our assumptions and think critically about how we approach these important decisions.
So as we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Imagine you're applying for your dream job. Which approach would you prefer be used in evaluating you? The traditional approach that really focuses on that test score, or the alternative approach that tries to take a more holistic view?
It's a great question to ponder, because ultimately these decisions shape not just individual careers, but entire organizations and industries.
And on that note, we're going to sign off for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive into the world of IO psychology. We'll see you next time.